Hello everyone, and welcome back to another reaction video. Today we are continuing on our Napoleonic Wars journey, and today we're going for what I would call the climax of the Napoleonic Wars, the Battle of the Nations, also known as the Battle of Leipzig. So without further ado, let's get going. Between a battle lost and a battle won, the distance is immense, and there stand empires. And that's very true indeed. Just as this was the decisive battle of that would determine the fate of Napoleon's empire, there have been many other countries and empires that have fallen due to the outcome of a single battle. And it's pretty scary, to think that one event could bring forth such change.
October 1813. Napoleon Bonaparte faced his greatest crisis since becoming Emperor of the French 9 years before. His long war in Spain had ended in defeat, and an Anglo-Spanish-Portuguese army had now crossed the Pyrenees to invade France itself. In Germany, the Kingdom of Bavaria had switched sides and joined the Sixth Coalition against France. While in Saxony...
That's kind of rude, and the only reason Bavaria is the size it is. Like, this is the biggest Bavaria has ever been in history, and it's all due to Napoleon. But, I understand the situation the members of the Confederation of the Rhine were in at this point was quite rough. And I think everyone realized that Napoleon was on the ropes, and at this point you gotta make a choice. If you don't side with the Allies now, it will be too late later, and you will suffer an even greater penalty than you would have otherwise. So for these larger members of the Confederation, it's time to put up or shut.
Napoleon faced 4 armies converging on him from all directions. What's more, these were not the same bunglers he'd crushed in 1805 and 6 at Austerlitz and Jena. Prussia, Austria and Russia had all learned from their mistakes. They were now better organized, trained and led, and more wary of Napoleon. The largest coalition force was the Army of Bohemia, commanded by Austrian Field Marshal, the Prince of Schwarzenberg. His was a huge mixed Austrian-Russian-Prussian army of 194,000 men and 790 guns.
Yes, the Army of Bohemia was truly titanic in size. It was as big as Napoleon's army at this point. The entire of Napoleon's army. So yeah, like I said, this is a huge mix of Austrians, Prussians, and Russians. Now, I've talked about Field Marshal Schwarzenberg before, and I think he is a overly cautious general for this age. And while that was not a bad trait per se, he really wasn't all that too effective against Napoleon, or when he faced off with Napoleon directly. But he has some good sub-commanders here. He's got General Wittgenstein and Barclay, 2 competent Russian generals. Grand Duke Constantine, of course, who is well, actually at this point he is the officially the heir to the Russian imperial throne. And then we have Schwarzenberg himself, of course.
To the north, Blücher's army of Silesia, and the Army of the North under Napoleon's ex-marshal Bernadotte, now Crown Prince of Sweden. Together, 130,000 men and 536 guns.
Yes, I think most of you know of these 2 characters. Blücher is famous for his aggressiveness. That's why they call him Marshal Vorwärts in German. And of course, then we have Bernadotte, who was the former marshal of Napoleon. Yeah, he has brought great insights into Napoleonic warfare and the Grande Armée to the Sixth Coalition, and has proved quite invaluable in assisting them in taking down Napoleon. And here we got majority Russian troops. We got some Prussians, and the Swedish army, about 30,000 men. Although the Swedish army really doesn't participate much at all during this campaign, and there are a few reasons for that, which we will get into later on.
To the southeast, General Bennigsen's Army of Poland, besieging Dresden. Another 34,000 men and 135 guns.
135 guns for an army with 34,000 men is really overdoing it. But at this stage, the Allies are bringing all their resources to bear, which means there's an inordinate amount of cannons on the battlefield. And of course, everyone knows Bennigsen, who commanded during the 1806-1807 Polish campaign. And he tried, but unsuccessfully, could not save Prussia from utter annihilation by Napoleon.
In total, the coalition had fielded 360,000 men and 1,500 guns, with Russia supplying the bulk of the troops.
I cannot really begin to describe how unprecedented this battle is. There has never been a battle in world history up until this point that had brought 360,000 men and 1,500 guns. And that's just one side. If you combine it with Napoleon's army, you got 500,000 men and about 2,000 cannons, which is an absolutely insane number of troops and cannons, which, well, you can figure out the results of this battle yourself, but it's gonna get bloody, really bloody.
One unique addition to Bernadotte's Army of the North was a single troop of British rocket artillery, an experimental weapon system based on the Congreve rocket, a type seen here in 1830. Although wildly inaccurate, their high explosive warhead could be devastating at close range. Napoleon's forces around Leipzig were outnumbered almost 2-1. But with 200,000 men and 700 guns, the Grande Armée was still a force to be reckoned with many experienced troops and commanders, even though it increasingly relied on young conscripts to make up numbers.
Yes, this is a far cry from the Grande Armée of 1805-1806, which was when it was at its height of power, I would say. At this point, Napoleon has lost most of his veteran troops. He still has many experienced commanders, which is good, and that will help him during this battle. But reality is the majority of his troops are young, inexperienced conscripts. And that has been the case all throughout the German campaign, which is why he has taken so many losses and has been steadily whittled down as time has gone on. But, as they said, still a force to be reckoned with, and with Napoleon commanding it, any army is going to be a challenge to beat.
There were another 140,000 men that Napoleon could not call on. General Rapp's 10th Corps besieged in Danzig, Marshal Saint-Cyr's 1st Corps besieged in Dresden, Marshal Davout's 13th Corps holding Hamburg, as well as several smaller besieged garrisons across Germany and Poland.
And this is really a shame for Napoleon, because General Rapp, Marshal Saint-Cyr and Davout are three of his most able commanders. General Rapp has saved Napoleon's life several times and has been a faithful aide-de-camp, basically Napoleon's fixer. If Napoleon had an odd job that needed to get done, Rapp could go in and command that corps or division or whatever and get the job done. And Davout, probably his most tactically brilliant marshal, and Saint-Cyr himself was very able, especially in defensive warfare. So all of these commanders, even if they didn't bring their armies, if they could just bring themselves and their leadership, that would have been a huge boost for Napoleon's chances to win this battle. But alas, it was not to be.
Napoleon was currently about 20 miles north of Leipzig with the bulk of his army. Marshal Murat was 40 miles to the south with 90,000 men, covering Schwarzenberg. Napoleon now decided to rapidly join Murat, and with their temporary superiority in numbers, defeat Schwarzenberg, before Bernadotte and Blücher could intervene. Murat had orders to conduct a fighting withdrawal northwards. But at Liebert-Volkwitz, he was drawn into major combat with the enemy's advance guard. Around 12,000 horsemen fought what some have described as the largest cavalry battle in Europe's history. Murat, in the thick of it as usual, was very nearly captured by Prussian dragoons.
Yes, the Battle of Liebert-Volkwitz sort of exposed Marshal Murat's limitations as an army commander. This was a major, unnecessary cavalry battle, and although both sides came off equally bad, the fact is Napoleon could not spare any cavalry at this point. He didn't have a lot of them anymore. The huge cavalry reserves that he used to bring on a campaign in the past is gone now. So, yeah, Napoleon cannot afford casualties, any unnecessary casualties at this point, especially not casualties involving cavalry.
The battle ended in a minor coalition victory, with around 2,000 casualties on each side. The next day, Napoleon arrived to take command.
Children, today is France's last day. Today, we must have won or all be dead. General Maison to the 16th Division. Quite a powerful statement to make.
By the 16th of October, Napoleon had concentrated most of his forces south of Leipzig. Field Marshal Schwarzenberg, meanwhile, against Russian advice, had deployed his army on either side of the Pleiße River, which would hinder his movements throughout the battle.
Yes, in the planning of this battle, the Allies decided to go for a complete envelopment. And although Schwarzenberg was the commander-in-chief, Alexander I of Russia was the supreme commander. And for once, he actually offered some sage advice here. And he told Schwarzenberg basically that this was not a good deployment. And what would happen is that Napoleon could break through at one point in the line, and then those Austrian reinforcements are going to be on the wrong side of the river, and they're not going to be able to come around and help anytime soon. So, for once, Alexander I, who is not known for his military brinkmanship, actually offered some good advice, although he didn't want to overrule Schwarzenberg directly, because he sort of didn't want to take responsibility if things went badly. So he let Schwarzenberg redraft the battle plan in accordance with his wishes and advice. And in the end, they came up with something that let everyone do what they wanted, basically. So Schwarzenberg got his flanking attack here, and the Russians got some more reinforcement to shore up the line, and they moved Blucher around to come from the north. So, it all worked out in the end, but it demonstrates the problem with the chain of command that exists within the coalition at this point. In Napoleon's headquarters, it's Napoleon who has the only and final say on all matters. And so there isn't much room for debate, which can be both good and bad. But in most instances, that was a good thing, because Napoleon was such a genius. And for the coalition, this was a recurring problem, that they couldn't agree or couldn't coordinate properly. And it's only by this late stage that they've finally been able to do some basic level of cooperation to take down Napoleon once and for all.
Napoleon had entrusted the northern sector to Marshal Ney, with orders to keep an eye out for Blücher and Bernadotte. But Napoleon didn't expect them for at least another day, and so Ney had orders to transfer most of his troops south for the attack on Schwarzenberg. Schwarzenberg, however, knew that Blücher and Bernadotte were closer than Napoleon suspected, and that Bennigsen was also marching up from Dresden. This was the moment the coalition had been waiting for. All their armies converging on Napoleon, with overwhelming superiority in numbers. However, the coalition's headquarters were nothing like Napoleon's,
as I said,
where one man's will decided all. Schwarzenberg had to attempt to coordinate the actions of 3 large armies from 3 separate states. And although he was commander-in-chief, his plans still needed to be approved by Emperor Alexander, the supreme commander, whilst he also managed relations with the King of Prussia and the Emperor of Austria, all of whom were present at his headquarters.
Now, luckily for the coalition, both Francis of Austria and Frederick William of Prussia weren't all that interested in meddling in the nitty-gritty details of the battle plan, which would have complicated affairs much more than it already had been. So, fortunately, they just hung around and didn't stick their nose in.
The plan finally agreed was for General Wittgenstein's corps group to lead an attack in 4 main columns, with 2 Austrian flanking attacks west of the Pleiße. At 8 a.m., a bombardment began along the line, as Russian, Austrian, and Prussian infantry regiments advanced across cold, muddy fields. Wachau soon fell to Russian infantry, but French artillery fire made it impossible for them to advance further. Victor's Second Corps then counterattacked, retaking the village at bayonet point. Wachau would change hands twice more that morning. These bloody contests for small Saxon villages would come to typify the fighting around Leipzig. At Markkleeberg, Kleist's Prussian Second Corps drove out the Polish defenders after bitter fighting, while on the left bank of the Pleiße, Merveldt's Austrian Second Corps struggled across broken ground to attack well-defended villages. Their assault on Konnewitz stalled, but with heavy losses, the Austrians got a toehold in Dörlitz. On the right flank, around 10 a.m., Klenau's 4th Corps occupied the high ground of the Kolmberg and fought its way into Liebert-Wolkwitz. Napoleon, observing from Gallows Hill, ordered up Augereau's 9th Corps and the Young Guard in support. MacDonald's 11th Corps was now also arriving in position on his left. His troops retook the Kolmberg and counterattacked Liebert-Wolkwitz, driving out the Austrians and pursuing them over the fields beyond. The advance was only halted when Russian Cossacks were sighted on their open left flank, a warning that Bennigsen's army was not far off.
Yeah, Cossacks, they're a very common feature of the later battles of the Napoleonic Wars. And although they weren't much used in direct combat per se, that was not their strength. Their strength was to harass lines of communications, operate behind enemy lines, perform raids. That's what they were good for. So, but still, if you have such a huge open left flank like Napoleon has here, he can't afford to advance any further unless he got some cavalry to stop the Cossacks from outflanking them. And at this point, Napoleon's holding back most of his cavalry for a decisive blow.
The coalition offensive was going nowhere, with most of its modest gains lost to French counterattacks. But there was one sector where the coalition had more success that morning. General Goulay's Austrian Third Corps, with orders to threaten Napoleon's line of retreat, advanced over marshy ground towards Lindenau. Ney had to divert Bertrand's Fourth Corps to reinforce the village and ensure the road to France was kept open. Napoleon was waiting for Ney's reinforcements before launching his attack on Schwarzenberg. But now, Fourth Corps was tied down at Lindenau, and there was more bad news from Ney.
Yeah, the fact that Bertrand's corps was diverted to Lindenau was not good for Napoleon, even though they managed to fight them off, and it was necessary to fight them off to maintain the line of retreat back to France. Still, he really could have used any reinforcements that could have been spared for his planned attack in the south.
Blücher's army of Silesia was approaching from the northwest. Marmont's Sixth Corps had to turn about to keep the Prussians at bay. Heavy fighting broke out around Möckern, the village itself held by elite French Marines, while Dąbrowski's Polish division clung on to Wiedrich under attack from an entire Russian corps.
Yes, at this point, Napoleon has called up the sailors of the Imperial Guard, which was an elite unit, part of the Imperial Guard, which, normally wouldn't have been used in any land campaigns. But still, they were an elite force, and they could be used on land if necessary, and they proved very capable of doing so. And it shows how desperate the situation has become, that Napoleon has to rely on National Guardsmen and his Imperial Guard to shore up the line.
This was a nasty surprise for Napoleon, who'd thought Blücher was still a day's march away. But the old Prussian general, hearing cannon fire to the south, had urged his men on and into the attack. Blücher intended to draw as many French troops onto himself as possible to assist Schwarzenberg's army of Bohemia. His actions and the bloody fight for Möckern may just have saved the coalition from defeat.
That's not entirely an exaggeration. If Napoleon had gotten all of Ney's troops down south, he probably would have had enough men to break the coalition lines on the first day. And if that happened, well then, the campaign could have been won. Now all hell was let loose. It seemed impossible that there could be any space between the bullets and balls which rained onto us. Unknown Russian officer. Yeah, this is gonna be bloody.
Napoleon was outnumbered across the whole battlefield. But in the south he still had a numerical advantage. Not as large as he'd hoped, nor likely to last long. Schwarzenberg and Alexander were already moving up reserves, though Schwarzenberg now found that his were on the wrong side of the Pleiße River, costing precious hours.
Should have listened.
It was now or never for Napoleon. At 2 p.m., he ordered the attack to begin. A grand battery of 180 guns blasted the enemy lines.
Yeah, I think this is the largest grand battery that Napoleon ever assembled. 180 guns in one battery is absolutely insane. And that was a lot of firepower. But this was Napoleon's trademark artillery tactic, to assemble lots of guns at one point, blast the enemy lines, then charge in with infantry and cavalry to finish off the enemy. And nobody knew artillery quite as well as Napoleon did. And even at this late stage of the war, French artillery, generally speaking, is superior to coalition artillery. They were more accurate, and just the guns and gun crews were just better, basically.
Then Victor's 2nd Corps, Lauriston's 5th Corps, and the Young Guard began their advance. In support, Murat gathered 2 entire cavalry corps, 10,000 horsemen, and led them in one of the great mass cavalry charges of the Napoleonic Wars.
I think this act is telling how desperate Napoleon's situation was. Normally, you'd send in the cavalry afterwards. But here, he's doing the same as he did at Eylau, basically, trying to break the enemy's center with a massive cavalry charge. And that's because he doesn't have the infantry reserves to pull off or to fill the center of this attack. So he has to do use all the available resources he has at his disposal.
Cuirassiers of the 1st Heavy Cavalry Division broke through to the main enemy battery. Some even nearly reached the 3 coalition monarchs. But the ground was marshy and broken by fences and ditches. The French horses were soon exhausted and the squadrons disordered.
It was not at all uncommon that the cavalry squadrons would become disordered after a major charge like this. And so a competent cavalry commander would have his men pull back and regroup before they were countercharged.
Austrian cuirassiers and Russian Guard cavalry were coming up from the south. When these fresh Allied cavalry reserves charged the French, a great melee ensued. But the French were eventually driven back to their start line. Maison's division of the 5th Corps was involved in a desperate struggle for Geldengossa. The fighting swept back and forth through the village, the streets filling with dead and wounded from both sides. But as Russian and Prussian Guard regiments arrived to reinforce the village, the French were forced to fall back. Around 4 p.m., the Austrian Reserve Corps finally arrived and renewed the assault on Markkleeberg, one of the morning's objectives, which was finally secured. By 5 p.m. it was clear that Napoleon didn't have enough reserves to force a decisive outcome in the south. To the north, Merkern was being stubbornly held by French Marines with lethal close-range artillery support. But despite terrible losses, York's Prussian Corps continued to attack.
Yeah, by lethal close-range artillery support, they mean canister shot. Basically, a giant shotgun just keeps blasting these charging Prussians. And, canister was not used all that often during the Napoleonic Wars, but when it was always devastating.
Marshal Marmont himself was wounded twice, but remained in command. Finally, a brilliant charge by Prussian hussars triggered a French rout. Merkern fell as Marmont's corps streamed back towards Leipzig. As dusk fell around 6 p.m., fighting died out across the battlefield. The first day of the battle had cost the French an estimated 25,000 casualties. The coalition at least 30,000. Napoleon had come close, but failed to land a decisive blow. The chance for victory was slipping from his grasp.
8th Corps have lost a third of their men and many officers. All ammunition stocks have been used up. We have not enough to maintain combat for 1 hour. Marshal Poniatowski. Yes, during this entire battle, Napoleon, and this is not strange at all considering the intensity of the fighting, but Napoleon's forces would have continual shortages of ammunition and other supplies to form effective combat, basically. And this was a big reason for why there was a lull during the second day.
Sunday the 17th of October brought a lull, with both armies exhausted by the previous day's fighting. Napoleon needed to rest his troops and resupply them with ammunition, which was running dangerously low. He also sent a message to his father-in-law, Emperor Francis I, suggesting an armistice and finally offering concessions. But the Allies were no longer interested. They knew time was on their side.
And it wasn't like Napoleon gave up huge concessions. He basically offered to retreat beyond a certain line, and then there would be a ceasefire, and then there would be talks for a peace agreement. Napoleon needed to do this way before. If he wanted peace, he should have done it after the armistice after Bautzen. And yeah, now it's too late, because the coalition knows it's only a matter of time.
The only major combat that day occurred in the north, where Blücher continued to attack. Russian infantry stormed Eutrich and Gorlice. Russian hussars charged and routed part of Arrighi's 3rd Cavalry Corps. That day, Napoleon received 14,000 reinforcements when Reynier's French Saxon 7th Corps arrived from the northeast. But the same day, the coalition received more than 100,000 reinforcements, as their armies continued to converge on Leipzig. Colloredo's Austrian 1st Corps, Bennigsen's Army of Poland, and Bernadotte's Army of the North, though the latter was widely criticized for his leisurely march to the battlefield.
Yeah. Now, why would he take such a leisurely march to the battlefield? Well, there's been several explanations offered, and it's probably a combination of all explanations, really. One suggestion is that Bernadotte had received information that Napoleon was going to renew an attack on Berlin and send some forces north. I don't think that was really the case. And the second explanation is that Bernadotte, his position in Sweden was tenuous. He was an outsider, he was an adopted heir, and so he could not come back from this war with a bunch of dead Swedish soldiers. That would have seriously damaged his reputation and standing as heir to the throne. And that's also why Bernadotte really never let the Swedish army be put into action. Only at the last final stage at the Battle of Leipzig did the Swedish army join, or parts of the army joined, the actual combat. I think this is a believable explanation. And also, a third suggestion is that at this point, Bernadotte had great support from Alexander I, and there was discussions of him being named the King of France post-war. And he had the backing of the Emperor of Russia in this matter. And so going to war and killing a bunch of Frenchmen, being seen as so eager to fight against the French, would not have been very conducive to his potential standing as a king of France. So maybe all three of these factors played a part, or none of them did. I'm not sure there's a conclusive evidence for one cause or the other, but that's just my hypothesis.
The next day, Napoleon would face odds of nearly 2-1. It was time for the Emperor to begin planning his retreat.
I write you to on the morning of a battle, the like of which has been scarcely seen in the history of the world. We have surrounded the French Emperor. This battle will decide the fate of Europe. He was not wrong there, and this is one of the turning points of history that we so like to talk about. This is really it for Napoleon. It's do or die, and it's looking to be the latter at this point. And this is Gneisenau's letter. Gneisenau, of course, the very famous Prussian general, and would have a ship named after him in World War II. So there's that.
On Monday morning, the sun shone across 40 square miles of battlefield, on which nearly 500,000 troops and 2,000 cannon were assembled. Soldiers from France, Germany, Russia, Austria, Poland, Italy, Sweden, the Netherlands, and even Britain. This was truly the Battle of the Nations. In preparation for his withdrawal, Napoleon pulled back his forces into a tighter defensive perimeter and ordered Bertrand's 4th Corps to march west to secure the army's line of retreat. 2 divisions of the Young Guard under Marshal Mortier took their place at Lindenau. Schwarzenberg, meanwhile, planned to close the net on Napoleon with 6 converging attacks. Fighting in the south began around 8 a.m. The Austrians took Dörlitz, but Marshal Oudinot led a counterattack at the head of a Young Guard division and drove them out again.
The Young Guard is truly one of those heroic units of the Napoleonic Wars. The Young Guard did so well in so many campaigns, and these were, of course, the best conscripts of each year's intake. So they weren't particularly experienced, they were well drilled and very good, but still, they performed so many heroic feats for Napoleon. And it was the most active unit of the Imperial Guard. The Old Guard never saw battle, basically, until the end, in 1814, 1815. The Middle Guard, well, they had some showings too. And, I guess the other successful branch of the Imperial Guard would be the Guard Artillery, which did some really good work in blasting the enemy on multiple occasions.
Schwarzenberg was so alarmed by this reverse that he sent orders to recall Goulay's 3rd Corps. General Barclay's troops initially faced little opposition as they took Wachau and Liebert-Volkwitz, scenes of such bitter fighting 2 days before, but now scarcely defended. Barclay then paused, waiting for Bennigsen to get into position on his right before continuing his attack. Bennigsen's troops had more ground to cover, but towards noon, they'd driven back MacDonald's infantry and taken their objectives. They would now wait for Bernadotte's army to link up on their right. But the Army of the North was again making slow progress, for which many again blamed its commander, who seemed exceedingly cautious about facing his old master in battle.
Yeah, that's curious, but it could be that he was very I wouldn't say afraid of Napoleon, because, Bernadotte and Napoleon had two of the biggest egos in France. And, they weren't scared of each other or anything like that. Bernadotte certainly respected Napoleon's prowess as a military commander, and there is reason for caution. He knows Napoleon and the Grande Armée better than anyone, so, maybe that's a reason for his cautiousness. I don't really think he was afraid, though. That doesn't sound like Bernadotte.
Blücher, in contrast, did not hesitate to launch Russian infantry against Leipzig's northern defences, though their attack failed with heavy losses.
If all were demoralized and he appeared, his presence was like an electric shock. All shouted "Vive l'Empereur," and everyone charged blindly into the fire. And this is the thing about Napoleon. He has such a rare charisma that you rarely see in world history. Someone who can inspire men to die for him. And despite all the setbacks Napoleon has faced at this point, everyone is still... Nobody questions Napoleon's authority as emperor. Nobody questions his ability as a general. And when he shows up, he can inspire everyone, demoralized and routing troops, to turn back around, face the fire. It's an incredibly rare sort of personality that we will never see again. And you see these the same in people like Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, all of these heroic figures of history. So, I don't think we will ever see someone like Napoleon ever again.
By 2 p.m, Napoleon was hard-pressed on all fronts, but holding his own. His attention was now focused on Probstheide, key to his southern front, under attack from Kleist's Prussian Second Corps. French troops had turned the village into a fortress and inflicted terrible losses on the advancing Prussians. Probstheide was soon engulfed in smoke and fire as fighting raged on all sides. Some Prussian regiments lost half their men attacking the village, while 3 French generals were killed as they organized its defense. Napoleon even sent in Friant's division of the Guard to reinforce the position.
Yeah, at this point he cannot just let a perfectly healthy unit such as the Guard to sit back at this point. He needs them all to join the fighting.
To the north, Bernadotte's army was finally joining the battle in earnest. Marmont had assembled 137 guns around Schönefeld, which poured fire into the Russian ranks. In response, Bernadotte massed 200 guns of his own. The fields were soon strewn with the dead and wounded, as the sheer weight of fire made it impossible for either side to advance. Around 3 p.m, von Bülow's Prussian Corps, supported by Austrian Jaegers and its small British rocket detachment, attacked Paunsdorf. Grenier's 7th Corps could not withstand the onslaught. An hour later, around 3,000 Saxon soldiers rushed over to the enemy and surrendered. The Saxons were deeply disillusioned with their French allies. Their main wish now was for a quick end to a war that had ravaged their homeland for many months.
The Saxon defection was not a coincidence by any means. The week before the Battle of Leipzig, Marshal Bernadotte had issued a proclamation to the Saxons that they should defect, and if they do, they will be well treated by him. And they could take his word because Bernadotte had stood up for the Saxons when he was the commander of the Saxon Corps during the Battle of Wagram, and he stood up for them when Napoleon criticized their performance. And so, they trusted and believed Bernadotte. So And that is what prompted the defection, basically.
The hole in the line created by the Saxons' defection was soon plugged by Guard cavalry. But the coalition juggernaut could not be stopped. Towards dusk, under relentless Russian pressure, Marmont abandoned the burning ruins of Schönefeld, while the Prussians took Sellerhausen.
You can still see there, I don't know if you can see it down there in the south, the old guard is still not committed to the fight.
In the south,
it's basically the only unit
Haida
not committed.
Still held, but the situation was grim for Napoleon. The third day's fighting cost both sides another 25,000 casualties. Napoleon's army was exhausted, outnumbered, virtually encircled, and critically low on ammunition. Finally, the Emperor gave the order to retreat.
Sire, we will hold on. We are all ready to die for your majesty. Marshal Poniatowski to Napoleon, on receiving orders to form a rearguard.
Overnight, under cover of darkness and early morning fog, the French army withdrew behind Leipzig's walls, and at 4 a.m. began its retreat west, crossing the single bridge over the Elster River that led back to France. There'd been time and materials to build extra bridges, but in what would prove a serious oversight, no one had given the necessary orders.
And the responsibility of this falls partly on Marshal Berthier, the Napoleon's chief of staff. He knew there were not enough bridges to perform this evacuation. I also think one of the reasons that, I'm just speculating here, but one of the reasons that additional bridges was not built in advance could be because doing so would signal to the army and to the coalition that Napoleon was not confident he could win this battle, and he certainly was confident that he could pull off a victory here. So, I don't know, certainly appearances do matter, and it could have affected morale. I don't have any evidence that this was the case, I'm just speculating here. It certainly sounds plausible to me.
Furthermore, there was no clear plan for Leipzig's defense, which was left to a jumble of under-strength units, mostly Poles and Germans.
That was also normal. It was very rare for Napoleon to have French troops form the rear guard. It was often left to the foreign troops. The Germans and the Poles, in particular, often formed the rear guard of Napoleon's armies.
Napoleon left Leipzig around 10 a.m. Behind him there were scenes of mounting chaos and confusion, the city's streets jammed with troops, guns and wagons. The 20,000 wounded troops in the city had little hope of escape. 30 minutes later, shells began to rain on the city as the coalition launched an all-out assault from north, east and south. The rear guard held the city's gates for as long as they could, but they were soon overwhelmed by the enemy, and savage street fighting broke out across the city. A barge packed with gunpowder had been moored beneath the Elster Bridge, so that it could be quickly destroyed after the rearguard crossed. Around 2 p.m, a corporal lit the fuse when he saw Russian soldiers on the far bank, even though the bridge was still packed with troops, wagons and horses.
Yeah, this was not supposed to happen. A general had been put in charge of this operation, basically. And then he decided to delegate it to his subordinate, colonel, I believe, who in turn decided to delegate once more. So this unfortunate corporal was left with this job, and he was not informed of any of the details of the plan of when this bridge was supposed to be blown or under which circumstances. So it was left to his best judgment, and this is a major decision here, and it should not have been left in such a low-ranking officer's hand.
The bridge was destroyed in a gigantic explosion that trapped 30,000 men and 30 generals on the wrong side of the river.
Complete disaster.
Panic broke out among those who suddenly found themselves cut off. Most became prisoners, but some tried to swim for it, including the Polish Prince Poniatowski, made a marshal by Napoleon just 3 days before. Weak from his wounds, he rode his horse into the river, but as it tried to climb the steep far bank, it rolled over him, and he was drowned. Marshal MacDonald had also been cut off by the blast.
I also believe Marshal Oudinot was also cut off.
And resolved to escape or die trying. He found a place where engineers had cut down 2 trees as a makeshift bridge, and made his attempt. And there I was, 1 foot on either trunk and the abyss below me. A high wind was blowing. I was wearing a large cloak, and fearing that someone would grab at it, I got rid of it. I was already 3/4 of the way across when some men decided to follow me. Their unsteady feet caused the trunks to shake, and I fell into the water. Fortunately, I could touch the bottom, but the bank was steep, the soil loose and slippery. Some of the enemy's skirmishers came up. They fired at me point blank and missed me, and some of our men who happened to be nearby drove them off and helped me out. I was wet from head to foot, breathless and sweating heavily from my efforts. Marshal Marmont, who had got across early in the day, gave me a horse. I wanted dry clothes more, but they were not to be had. The loss of the bridge turned what was already a heavy defeat for Napoleon into a disastrous one. Later that day, the 3 Allied monarchs met in the center of Leipzig to celebrate their great victory. It had come at enormous cost. Exact numbers are impossible to establish, but in 4 days' fighting, the coalition armies suffered at least 52,000 casualties. Napoleon, who...
I would say that number is on the low end of the spectrum. The casualties were probably far greater, considering they were also the attackers here, attacking well-fortified French troops.
could less afford such losses, came off worse. 47,000 killed and wounded, 35,000 taken prisoner, 325 guns lost.
Catastrophe.
More men were killed and wounded at Leipzig than in any European battle before the First World War. Sir George Jackson, the British ambassador...
And you have to remember, this took place over the span of 4 days. And it's not really fair to compare to World War I, where battles and campaigns often lasted months, if not years. And of course, it was a whole other type of industrial warfare in World War I. But still, this says something about the ferocity and the absolute carnage that this battle was.
Ambassador to Austria rode over the battlefield with Metternich, the Austrian foreign minister, 2 days later. "A more revolting and sickening spectacle I never beheld," he wrote. "Scarcely could we move forward a step without passing over the dead body of some poor fellow, gashed with wounds and clotted with blood, another perhaps without an arm or a leg, here and there a headless trunk, or a head only, which caused our horses to stumble or start aside. It made one's blood run cold to glance upon the upturned faces of the dead. We got over this field of glory as quickly as we could."
Yeah, the sight must have been absolutely horrifying. The sight, the smells, the screams. Yeah, I wouldn't want to be anywhere near that battlefield. All of Europe was marching with us just a year ago. Today, all of Europe is marching against us. Napoleon to the Senate. That is very true. How the fortunate
Napoleon had suffered a calamitous defeat. He had lost the battle for Germany. His domination of Europe appeared at an end. With 80,000 survivors, he began a fighting retreat to the French border. There was now no chance of rescue for the 100,000 men trapped in garrisons across Germany and Poland.
The only reason Napoleon was able to evacuate with 80,000 men to begin with is the fact that the coalitions had taken so many heavy losses themselves, so they were not in a state where they could pursue Napoleon.
Though some would hold out for another 5 months. Marshal Murat took his leave of the Emperor, assuring him of his loyalty, but secretly planning to cut a deal with the Allies to save his throne in Naples. It was the last time the two men saw each other. 11 days after the Battle of Leipzig, Napoleon's former allies, the Bavarians, tried to block his escape at Hanau with 40,000 men. The Bavarian commander, von Wrede, had served with Napoleon in many campaigns. But on seeing his deployment for battle, Napoleon remarked, "I made him a count, but I couldn't make him a general."
Yeah, what they're getting at there is that Wrede was not very competent as a general, and his disposition was indeed very curious, putting most of his forces in front of a river, so if they had to retreat, there would be chaos. So that's kind of what Napoleon is getting at there.
The French Emperor then ordered the Imperial Guard to lead an attack that forced the enemy to fall back in disarray.
And why the Imperial Guard? Well, basically because all his other units are spent at this point. The Imperial Guard is the only unit that is somewhat fresh and intact, and had the will to go on, basically. But they were successful in repelling the Bavarians, and Napoleon was able to make his escape.
The French army reached the safety of Mainz 3 days later. Napoleon himself pushed on to Paris to contain the political damage from his defeat. Behind him, his empire was being dismantled. On the 4th of November, the coalition announced the dissolution of the Confederation of the Rhine, several of its former members now joining the war against France. In the Illyrian provinces, local revolts, Austrian invasion, and British naval support brought an end to French rule. In North Italy, Eugene was retreating steadily before the advance of von Hiller's Austrian army. While in Hamburg, Marshal Davout, with 34,000 troops, would soon be cut off and under siege. Napoleon's situation was desperate. But in the next campaign, fought for France itself, Napoleon would prove that he was still the master of war.
Yes, he would indeed. And the 1814 campaign is one of the most brilliant campaigns in military history and one of the most brilliant campaigns of Napoleon. And we will get to that in the next video. But that is it for the Battle of Leipzig. We've probably gone on well over an hour at this point, so I'm just going to make it quick. Sorry for I've been gone for a few weeks. I've been busy in real life, and these videos take a long time to make. And, that's why there's been a delay. But we're back, and hopefully we'll get more regularly scheduled content in the future. But anyways, if you liked the video, leave a like, leave a comment. I will love some additional context, thoughts. I always respond to all the comments. And of course, subscribe if you want more. And I'll see you guys next time.